In the mid-17th century, people began to die in the poorest neighborhoods, and no one wanted to believe it. The rumors arrived as whispers between neighbors, vague mentions of strange fevers, of bodies found at dawn in narrow alleyways. Dark swellings appeared in groins and armpits. Within days, entire families stopped opening their doors. The municipal authorities of Barcelona heard the reports and hesitated. Acknowledging the plague meant closing the port, paralyzing trade, and admitting that the most important city in Catalonia was vulnerable. They chose silence, and silence cost 15,000 lives. To understand the magnitude of what befell Barcelona that year, we first need to understand what that city represented, and the crushing weight of the circumstances that were already suffocating it before the first infected flea found its first human host within those walls. Barcelona was not just any city in the Western Mediterranean. It was the capital of a principality with centuries of its own institutional tradition, a political system founded on pacts between the estates and the crown, with governing bodies without equivalent in most European kingdoms. The Conseil de Cent, the municipal council of 128 members that had governed the city since the 13th century, represented a form of urban self-governance that most European cities simply did not possess. The Generalitat, the permanent institution born from the Catalan courts in the 14th century, administered the affairs of the entire principality. The Consolat de Mar, established in 1258, regulated maritime trade with a code that influenced port legislation throughout the entire Mediterranean basin. The Catalan courts, considered one of the first parliamentary bodies in Europe to prohibit unilateral legislation by the monarch, had been functioning since 1283. Barcelona was not merely a port, it was a center of power, with institutional roots reaching back to the medieval counts, a city that governed itself, that negotiated, that legislated with a sophistication that many European capitals could not even imagine. This tradition had generated real prosperity. For centuries, Catalan merchants maintained commercial consulates spread throughout the entire Mediterranean, from North Africa to Syria, from Flanders to the Greek islands. The Taula de Canvi, Barcelona's public bank founded in 1401, is frequently cited as the oldest public bank in Europe, predating the Bank of Venice and the Bank of Genoa. The city had dominated the trade of wool, silk, spices, coral, slaves, and manufactured goods for generations. Port traffic sustained a complex network of artisan guilds, tanners, weavers, blacksmiths, dyers, that formed the economic and civic backbone of the city, with direct representation in the Conseil de Cent through professional confraternities. But this power had already been eroding for generations. The union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon at the end of the 15th century, and above all the conquest of the Americas, shifted the axis of Spanish commerce to the Atlantic. Barcelona was left on the margins. The monarchy moved to Castile. The Mediterranean, which for centuries had been the great engine of Catalan wealth, became a secondary theatre. The merchants who once traded from North Africa to Flanders saw their routes lose relevance in the face of the gold and silver flowing from the Americas directly to Seville and Cadiz. The crisis of the 14th century had already exacted a brutal toll. Between 1347 and 1497, Catalonia lost 37% of its population in successive waves of plague, famine, and civil war. The countryside was left desolate, farms were abandoned. Barcelona's population, which had reached approximately 40,000 inhabitants at its medieval peak, had shrunk drastically and was recovering at a slow pace. Barcelona entered the 17th century as a power in decline governed by Castilian viceroys, and tensions with the central power became a constant. The popular imagination frequently assumes that 17th century Spain was a homogeneous power, a unified empire under a single will. The reality was radically different. The Hispanic monarchy was a mosaic of kingdoms, each with its own laws, its own courts, its own fiscal traditions, and its own political sensibilities, and the Count Duke of Olivares, principal minister of Philip IV, decided that this diversity was a problem. His policy of the Union of Arms intended to distribute the military and financial burdens of the empire more uniformly among all kingdoms. For Catalonia, this meant paying more taxes and supplying more soldiers for wars that the Catalans did not consider their own. The Catalan courts of 1626 and 1632 were never concluded, as the opposition of the Catalan estates systematically blocked Olivares's demands. Many of the proposed measures directly violated the Catalan constitutions, the privileges that the monarchs themselves had sworn to respect. The tension accumulated, and then came war. At the end of the 1630s, with Castilian troops quartered in Catalonia because of the conflict against France in the context of the 30 Years' War, Catalan peasants were forced to house and feed approximately 10,000 foreign soldiers in their own homes. Reports of religious sacrilege, destruction of personal property, and violence against women spread throughout the Catalan countryside. The rage exploded on the 7th of June, 1640, Corpus Christi, when reapers armed with sickles descended upon Barcelona from Sant Andreu del Palomar. When the Bishop of Barcelona, after blessing the enraged crowd, asked who was their captain and what was their banner, the rebels raised a crucifix covered with a black cloth and shouted that there was their captain and their banner. The Spanish viceroy, the Count of Santa Coloma, was assassinated during the revolt. The War of the Reapers had begun. Pau Claris, president of the Generalitat, transformed the peasant revolt into a political cause. He proclaimed an ephemeral Catalan republic and, within days, transferred sovereignty to Louis XIII of France, who became Count of Barcelona. Catalonia traded one master for another. French troops entered the principality as protectors, but the protection came accompanied by heavy taxes, plunder, and an arrogance that was in no way inferior to the Castilian one. The Catalan population found itself pressed between two empires, each demanding loyalty and resources that an exhausted principality could no longer offer. The war dragged on for more than a decade, with battles, sieges, and counterattacks that devastated cities and countryside throughout all of Catalonia. It was in this scenario of a decade of continuous war, with devastated fields, ruined harvests, displaced populations, and emptied municipal coffers, that the plague found its way to Barcelona. The disease did not appear out of nowhere. It had been advancing across the Iberian Peninsula like a slow and relentless wave since 1647, the so-called Great Plague of Seville, which possibly originated in Algeria, first struck the Spanish Mediterranean coast. Valencia was the first major city to be devastated, losing approximately 30,000 inhabitants. The disease then spread across Andalusia, where the coast of Malaga lost more than 50,000 people. Seville, where quarantine measures were ignored, evaded, or simply never proposed, lost 150,000 of its 600,000 inhabitants. In total, Spain lost approximately 500,000 people, nearly 5% of its population. The plague did not respect political borders, military alliances, or diplomatic treaties. It followed the routes of trade, the paths of soldiers, the transit of refugees. From the Levantine coast, the disease climbed northward, entering the territories of the Crown of Aragon. Tortosa, Tarragona, Lleida, city after city, the plague left its trail of dead and silence. From Valencia and Catalonia, The disease leapt across the sea and struck Majorca via the port of Sola, killing between 14 and 15,000 of the island's 90 to 100,000 inhabitants, with 9,000 deaths concentrated in Palma. Catalonia, which was already bleeding from a civil war and a foreign occupation, now faced an enemy that could not be fought with sickles or muskets. The first rumors of contagion within Barcelona began to circulate shortly after New Year's Day of 1651. The news came from the city's poorest neighborhood, where the streets were narrowest, the houses most cramped, the water dirtiest, and the rats most abundant. The authorities of the Conseil de Saint heard the reports and made a choice that would prove catastrophic. They hesitated to impose full quarantine, officially recognizing the presence of the plague within the walls would have devastating economic consequences for a city already strangled by war. The port would be closed, trade paralyzed, the few provisions still entering would be cut off. In a context of war and occupation, admitting weakness could mean surrender. The decision not to act was, in itself, a death sentence. The plague operated with a biological efficiency that no human institution of the 17th century could understand or combat. The bacterium Yersinia pestis traveled in the blood of fleas that infested black rats. These rats inhabited the cellars of houses, grain stores, and the hulls of ships. When a rat died of infection, its fleas sought a new host. If they did not find another rat, they found a human being. The bite was almost imperceptible. Within hours, the bacterium invaded the lymph nodes. Painful swellings, the so-called buboes, appeared in the armpits, the groin, the neck. Fever escalated rapidly. The skin darkened in hemorrhagic blotches. Black boils that oozed blood and pus covered the body. In many cases, fewer than 5 days passed between the first symptom and death. None of this was understood at the time. Barcelona's physicians, trained in the Galenic tradition inherited from Montpellier, attributed the disease to miasmas and imbalances of the bodily humors. Their recommendations included scrubbing floors with vinegar, drinking orange juice, wearing linen, and keeping windows open facing the north wind. They burned aromatic woods such as juniper and rosemary on street corners, hoping to purify the air. Measures perhaps useful against other ailments. Against the bubonic plague, they were absolutely useless. Within weeks, what had begun as rumors in the poor neighborhood became a reality impossible to deny. The city's lazaretto, the pest house where the sick were confined, swelled until it housed 4,000 patients simultaneously. The physicians and surgeons who worked there began themselves to fall ill and die. The priests who entered to administer last rites heard confessions holding a lit torch between themselves and the dying, hoping that the fire would purify the air. It was a barrier of flame against the invisible. It did not work. The mortality rate among those who cared for the sick was so high that the city faced a chronic shortage of people willing to work in the lazaretto. Care became as dangerous as the disease. Thousands of Barcelonans fled. Those who had resources, merchants, nobles, members of the liberal professions, abandoned the city for the countryside or towns not yet affected. This pattern repeated itself in every epidemic since the Black Death of 1348. The rich fled, the poor stayed to die. The flight of the privileged emptied Barcelona of its leadership at precisely the moment it was most needed. A tanner named Miquel Parets, who remained in the city throughout the entire epidemic, recorded in his diary the behavior of the elites with open bitterness. Unlike the official accounts, which portrayed the authorities as bastions of rational order amid popular superstition, Parets accused the local elites of negligence, selfishness, and abuse of power during the contagion. It was a rare perspective in plague literature. The voice of an ordinary artisan documenting the collapse of his city without the filters of the powerful. Parets' records are chilling in their everyday details. Prisoners in the city jail discovered they could escape by claiming to be infected. The guards, terrified, opened the doors and retreated. Mothers died, leaving newborns desperately in need of wet nurses, and the frantic search for women willing to breastfeed potentially contaminated children became one of the cruelest dramas of the epidemic. Entire streets became deserted. The habitual sound of a bustling city, carts over cobblestones, merchants shouting prices, ongoing construction, was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of the carts that collected corpses. The bells of Barcelona's churches, which for centuries had marked the rhythm of urban life, transformed into a continuous funeral toll. Until the churches stopped ringing altogether. There were too many dead to count. And as if the plague were not enough, war arrived at the gates. In July of 1651, while the epidemic devoured the city from within, a Spanish army of approximately 24,000 soldiers, commanded by Don Juan José de Austria, bastard son of Philip IV, descended upon Barcelona and began a siege. The city, already devastated by disease, was now also besieged by land and blockaded by sea. Supply lines were cut. Food prices within the walls skyrocketed. The inhabitants were forced to eat cats, dogs, roots, and contaminated water sources. The Franco-Catalan garrison, composed of approximately 4,000 to 5,000 men, including Catalan regiments, 2 Swiss regiments, and elements of French regiments, attempted to defend walls that the disease emptied every week. The convergence of plague and siege created a military paradox without solution. Defense demanded concentration of men on the walls and on the Renaissance bastions that protected the urban perimeter. The plague demanded dispersal and isolation. The two needs were mutually exclusive. Soldiers crowded together became easy targets for fleas. Civilians confined within the besieged city could not flee, as their ancestors had done in previous epidemics. Barcelona became a trap. The walls that existed to protect now served to imprison a population together with its own scourge. Outside, the besieging army also suffered. Archaeological excavations in the district of La Sagrera revealed mass graves containing more than 500 skeletons of Spanish soldiers with no combat wounds. DNA analyses identified paratyphoid fever as the cause of death, not the bubonic plague. The hasty burials, accompanied by remains of uniforms, coins, and utensils, date from the final phase of the siege. Disease killed on both sides of the walls in different but equally lethal versions. Don Juan José de Austria opted for a strategy of gradual strangulation instead of direct assault, betting that hunger and disease would do the work that his cannons could not. Inside the city, the institutional structure that had governed Barcelona for centuries collapsed. The Consell Dissent saw its members die one after another. The councillors who led the municipal government were reduced to numbers that made any formal deliberation nearly impossible. The administrative apparatus that collected taxes, organized defense, regulated markets, and maintained public order simply ceased to function. The city that prided itself on its self-governance discovered that no constitution, no charter of privileges, no pact with the crown could govern the dead. Religion offered the only explanation that most people could comprehend. The plague was divine punishment, the wrath of God against the city's sins. Penitential processions traversed streets that still had people alive to traverse them. Prohibitions against blasphemy were decreed as if moral purity could stop a bacterium. Pilgrims were sent to Santiago de Compostela to implore celestial intercession. The churches that still functioned held continuous masses for souls that departed faster than they could be counted. The tragic irony was that religious gatherings, processions, masses, collective penances, functioned as accelerators of contagion. The faith that was supposed to save contributed to killing. When the plague began to recede around September of 1651, at least 15,000 Barcelonans had died. In a city that probably counted between 30 and 40,000 inhabitants, this represented the loss of at least 1/3 of the population in a few months. But the relief of the plague's end did not bring peace. The Spanish siege continued. The famine persisted. The French, mired in the internal problems of the Fronde, sent sporadic rescue attempts that failed to break through the Spanish lines. A relief incursion in December of 1651 failed. Barcelona was alone. The siege dragged on for another year. The combined losses from plague, famine, and combat reached 10,000 dead among civilians, and military within the walls during 1652. In October of that year, after 15 months of siege, the Spanish forces finally breached the defenses. Barcelona capitulated. The brief Catalan experiment of independence under French protection came to an end. Philip IV issued a general pardon and formally reaffirmed the Catalan charters, but the restoration was conditional and incomplete. Spanish troops remained garrisoned at Montjuic Castle, ensuring permanent royal supervision over a city that no longer had the strength to resist. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, signed in 1659 without consulting the Catalans, ceded the county of Roussillon and the northern half of Cerdagne to France, permanently dividing the Catalan territories. Miquel Parés survived the plague, but he lost his wife and 3 of his children. His diary contains one of the most heart-rending passages in all of European plague literature, the account of an ordinary man narrating the death of his family without rhetoric, without grandiloquence, only with the devastating precision of someone who documents the unbearable because he no longer knows what else to do with the pain. The plague of 1651 was the last great epidemic of bubonic plague to strike Barcelona. But its legacy is not measured only in buried bodies. It accelerated a transformation already underway: the definitive decline of medieval Catalan autonomy, the consolidation of centralized power from Madrid, the reconfiguration of the relationship between the state and its territories. The convergence of plague and war revealed with brutality the fragilities of a political system that, however sophisticated it may have been in times of peace, did not possess mechanisms to survive simultaneous catastrophe. The institutions that the Catalans had built over 4 centuries emerged from the episode permanently weakened. 62 years later, in 1714, after another war and another siege, Philip V would abolish the Conseil de Cent, the Generalitat, and the Catalan universities, imposing the decrees of Nueva Planta that put an end to the ancient rights and freedoms. He ordered the demolition of an entire section of the Ribera neighborhood to build the Ciutadella, a military fortress designed to watch over the population of Barcelona, which would terrorize them for more than a century. Deserted streets, locked doors, authorities hesitating between truth and economic convenience, the rich fleeing while the poor die. Healthcare systems collapsing under a demand for which they were not designed, and ordinary citizens recording the catastrophe because they feel that someone needs to tell what really happened. Does this really sound like ancient history, or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? The plague of Barcelona was not merely a health crisis. It was the moment when a city discovered that all its institutions, all its traditions, all its walls of stone and of law were insufficient against an enemy that traveled in the blood of a flea. Well then, I am Tim, observing the past so that we may understand the present. And together we keep history being reborn. I'll see you in the next era.